The jawoggle is the apex of high strangeness in Appalachian folklore. It is a biological chimera featuring the snarling head of a wolf, the broad, feathered wings of an eagle, and the powerful, muscled legs of a stallion. Interestingly, despite its wings, it cannot fly. Instead, it uses them as aerodynamic rudders to sprint at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour through the densest underbrush. It is often seen dragging a heavy, woven sack that emits the scent of summer wildflowers even in the dead of winter. It is believed to be a servant of the deep ridge spirits, tasked with carrying the memories of the forest into the next season. Sightings in the Rockton periphery often occurred during the first heavy snowfall of the year. Elias Thorne stood on the sagging porch of his cabin, the cedar planks groaning beneath his boots like a living thing. The air in Clinton County had turned brittle overnight, a sharp, metallic tang clinging to the back of his throat that signaled the arrival of the cold front. It wasn't just the temperature drop, it was the specific weight of the atmosphere, a pressure that seemed to push the very oxygen out of the valley. To the east, the jagged spine of the mountains looked like a bruised knuckle against the darkening sky. He rubbed his hands together, the skin dry and papery, feeling the grit of wood ash still trapped in the creases of his palms. The first flake fell not with a flutter, but with a purpose. It was fat and heavy, landing on the rusted railing of his porch and refusing to melt. Elias watched it, his breath hitching in a plume of silver vapor. He knew the lore of the Rockton periphery better than he knew the names of his own cousins. He knew that the first snow wasn't just a change in weather, it was a boundary line. In these woods, the transition between autumn and winter was a thin place, a temporal seam where the things that lived in the deep ridges decided what was worth keeping and what was meant to rot. He stepped off the porch, his boots sinking into the dry, frost-crisped mast of the forest floor. The crunch was deafening in the unnatural silence. Usually, the chickadees or the squirrels would be making their final, frantic rounds, but today the woods were held in a suffocating hush. Even the wind had died down, leaving the hemlocks standing like dark, silent sentinels. Elias tilted his head, listening for the sound that shouldn't be there. He wasn't looking for a deer or a coyote. He was looking for the rhythm of something that moved with the cadence of a gallop but the silence of a predator. The scent hit him then. It was violent in its incongruity. In the middle of the freezing Pennsylvania wilds, amidst the smell of damp earth and coming ice, there was a sudden, overwhelming surge of wild bergamot, honeysuckle, and damp clover. It was the smell of a July afternoon, heavy and cloying, sticking to the inside of his nostrils. Elias felt a prickle of sweat break out along his spine despite the biting cold. He stayed perfectly still, his hand hovering near the rough bark of a white pine. Then he heard it. A rhythmic, heavy thudding, muffled by the thickening snow. It wasn't the erratic gait of a frightened buck. It was steady, powerful, and terrifyingly fast. Clop shhh. Clop shhh. The sound of iron-hard hooves hitting the frozen earth, followed by the dry rustle of feathers dragging through the laurel thickets. Elias didn't reach for a gun. You didn't shoot at the deep ridge servants unless you wanted the mountain to swallow you whole. Instead, he lowered his eyes, staring at the base of a nearby oak, offering the silent reverence of the witnessed. Through the periphery of his vision, a blur of motion streaked across the clearing. It was a nightmare stitched together from the remnants of the sky, the woods, and the pasture. The wolf's head was low, its snout wrinkled in a permanent, silent snarl, its eyes glowing with the amber light of a dying hearth. The eagle wings were tucked tight against its flanks, acting as stabilizers as it pivoted around a massive rock with impossible grace. And behind it, dragging through the dirt, was the sack. It was woven from silver-gray fibers that looked like spider silk and dried corn husks, bulging with an unseen weight. Every time the sack snagged on a root, another burst of that impossible summer scent filled the air, thick enough to taste. Elias watched the jawoggle vanish into the gray gloom of the hemlock stand, its speed so great that it left a wake in the falling snow, a tunnel of clear air that slowly collapsed behind it. He stood there for a long time, the smell of wildflowers slowly fading, replaced once more by the sterile, clean scent of the winter storm. He felt a profound sense of loss, as if the creature had just carried away the very memory of the sun. The forest felt emptier now, stripped of its secrets, prepared for the long, white sleep. He turned back toward his cabin, his feet feeling heavier with every step, knowing that the memories of the ridge were safe in the sack, waiting for a spring that felt 1,000 years away. The cabin appeared smaller when he climbed back onto the porch, a fragile box of tinder held together by stubbornness and rusted nails. Elias did not go inside immediately. He lingered by the door, his hand resting on the iron latch, watching the way the snow began to fill the deep, rectangular gouges left by the creature's hooves. They were vanishing quickly, the white powder smoothing over the earth as if the mountain were trying to erase the evidence of its own strange machinery. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was no longer expectant, but hollow, the kind of quiet that lives inside an empty cathedral once the congregation has departed. He thought of the sack and the weight it must have carried. He wondered if the scent of bergamot and clover belonged to the flowers he had seen by the creek in July, or if the creature gathered something less tangible. Perhaps it took the sound of the wind through the high pines or the specific golden hue of the light as it hit the valley floor at dusk. The idea that his own memories of the warmth might be tucked away in that woven vessel brought a strange comfort, a sense that nothing in the Rockton periphery was ever truly wasted. The ridge took its tithe, but it kept the ledger balanced in its own inscrutable way. Inside, the cabin was dark, the air smelling of cold ash and the faint, lingering ghost of wood smoke. Elias did not strike a match for the lantern. He sat in his heavy oak chair by the window, his eyes adjusted to the silver gloom of the afternoon. Outside, the world was dissolving into a monochrome blur. The hemlocks were losing their individual shapes, becoming a solid wall of shadow against the encroaching white. He felt the cold creeping through the chinking of the walls, a slow and inevitable invasion that demanded he build a fire, yet he remained motionless. His mind replayed the sight of the amber eyes. They hadn't looked at him with malice, nor with the mindless hunger of a beast. There had been a flickering intelligence there, a weary ancientness that spoke of a job performed 10,000 times before. The jawoggle was a gear in a clock he would never fully understand, a biological necessity for a landscape that refused to follow the rules of the world beyond the valley. He realized then that he was lucky to be a witness, a small, inconsequential observer to the turning of the great seasonal wheel. The wind began to pick up, a low moan that rattled the loose shingles above his head. It was no longer the soft hush of the first flake but the rising voice of a true Appalachian winter. Elias finally stood, his joints popping in the quiet room, and reached for the box of matches on the mantel. He struck one, the sulphurous flare momentarily blinding him, and touched it to the kindling he had prepared that morning. As the first orange flames began to lick at the dry birch bark, he looked back at the window one last time. The tracks were gone now, completely buried under the shifting drifts, leaving the forest looking pristine and indifferent, as if the monster and its cargo of summer had never existed at all. He sat by the growing fire, the warmth beginning to crawl across his shins, yet the phantom scent of wildflowers still seemed to cling to his wool coat. It was a heavy, floral ghost that refused to be exorcised by the mundane heat of seasoned oak. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring into the heart of the flames. He thought of the deep ridges, those inaccessible folds of the earth where the mapmakers gave up and the trees grew so thick that the sun never touched the ground. Somewhere up there, in a cave lined with the softest moss or a hollowed-out stone altar hidden by brambles, the jawoggle would be depositing its burden. He imagined the sack being upended, the concentrated essence of a lost summer spilling out like liquid gold into the dark. It would stay there, guarded by the spirits that wore the mountains like a shroud, held in trust until the earth tilted back toward the light. It was a beautiful thought, a necessary one for a man facing 4 months of isolation. Without the belief that the green world was being kept safe elsewhere, the gray finality of the snow would be unbearable. The Rockton periphery demanded this kind of faith from its inhabitants. You had to believe in the hidden machinery, or the silence would eventually drive you toward the cliffs. A branch snapped somewhere outside, the sound sharp as a pistol shot in the frigid air. Elias didn't flinch. He knew it was only the weight of the snow finally breaking the will of a dead limb. The forest was settling in, the animals huddling in their burrows, their heartbeats slowing to a rhythmic crawl. He felt a similar lethargy beginning to pull at his own limbs. The adrenaline that had spiked at the sight of the chimera was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He rose and walked to the small kitchen area, pouring a measure of water into a tin pot. His movements were slow and deliberate, mirroring the pace of the world outside. As the water began to hiss against the heat, he looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the cupboard. He looked older than he had that morning, his face etched with the same rugged geometry as the limestone outcroppings of the ridge. He was a part of this place, as much as the hemlocks or the shale, and one day, he supposed, his own memories would find their way into a woven sack, carried off by a creature that didn't know his name but understood his value to the mountain. The tea was bitter and hot, scalding his tongue, but it grounded him. He returned to his chair and watched the frost begin to bloom in intricate, feathered patterns across the window panes. They looked remarkably like the wings of the creature he had seen, delicate and sharp, a frozen mimicry of flight. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl through the chimney flue, a mournful sound that carried the echoes of the high places. He wasn't afraid. The Jawaggle had passed, the boundary had been drawn, and the memories of the forest were tucked away in the dark, waiting for the thaw. Elias Thorne pulled his blanket tight around his shoulders and let the heat of the fire lull him toward a dreamless, winter sleep. The fire began to die down into a bed of glowing embers, casting long, skeletal shadows against the log walls of the cabin. Elias felt the pull of the mountain even in his light slumber, a rhythmic thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his very marrow. It was the heartbeat of the ridge, slowed to a glacial pace, echoing the hibernation of the earth itself. He shifted in his chair, his head lolling to the side, and for a moment, the boundary between the waking world and the realm of the deep ridge spirits became porous. In that half-light of exhaustion, he could almost hear the rustle of the woven sack being dragged across the roof of his cabin, a dry, whispering sound like 1,000 dead leaves skittering over the shingles. He jerked awake, the movement sharp and sudden, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cabin was nearly dark now, the only light coming from the pulsing orange throat of the hearth. The silence was absolute, a heavy, muffled weight that pressed against his ears. He turned his gaze toward the window, but the frost had grown so thick that the world outside was completely obscured. It was as if the cabin had been lifted from the soil of Clinton County and set adrift in a sea of white marble. He stood up, his legs stiff and unyielding, and walked to the door. He didn't open it, he simply leaned his forehead against the cold wood, listening to the wood grain moan under the pressure of the rising wind. He knew that if he were to step outside now, the tracks of the Jawaggle would be gone, replaced by a smooth, featureless expanse of snow. The creature was likely miles away by now, navigating the treacherous ledges of the high peaks where the air was too thin for men to breathe. It would be moving with that same relentless, mechanical grace, its wolfen snout pointed toward the hidden sanctuaries of the north. Elias wondered if the creature ever rested, or if it was condemned to an eternal cycle of gathering and depositing, a ghost in the machinery of the seasons that could never experience the warmth it carried in its wake. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the chimney, a pocket of sap exploding in the heat, and a spray of sparks danced across the hearthstone. The momentary brightness illuminated a small, hand-carved figurine sitting on the mantel, a rough approximation of a deer Elias had made years ago. In the flickering light, the wooden animal seemed to tremble, its stillness a fragile defiance against the vast, predatory emptiness of the Pennsylvania wilds. He reached out and touched the carving, his fingers tracing the notches of the knife. It felt real, solid, and undeniably small. He realized then that the Jawaggle didn't just carry the scent of wildflowers, it carried the memory of the light that allowed things to grow. It was a steward of the spectrum, a guardian of the vibrant hues that the winter sought to bleach from the world. Without that heavy, woven sack, the spring would come back pale and hollow, a ghost of its former self. The mountain needed its monsters to keep its beauty intact. The horror of the wolf's head and the stallion's legs was the price paid for the return of the clover and the bergamot. It was a trade Elias understood deep in his gut, a grim bargain struck between the wild earth and the things that lived upon it. He moved back to his bed, pulling the heavy wool quilts up to his chin. The cold was beginning to bite now, a sharp reminder that the fire needed tending, but he lacked the strength to move again. He let his eyes close, the image of the amber-eyed chimera burned into his retinas like a photograph. He could still taste the honeyed air of the forest's memory, a sweet, cloying residue on his tongue that defied the logic of the frost. As he drifted back into the deep, dark well of sleep, he felt the cabin settle one last time, the wood groaning as it accepted the burden of the snow. The jewoggle was gone, the ridge was silent, and the long, white piece of the Rockton periphery had finally begun. The fire popped once more, a final, bright spark leaping from the hearth to die on the stone floor, and Elias felt the last of the cabin's warmth begin to retreat toward the ceiling. The cold was a physical presence now, a thin, silver needle probing the gaps in the window frames and the space beneath the heavy oak door. He pulled the quilts tighter, his chin ducked into the scratchy wool, and listened to the house settle into the deep freeze. The groans of the timber were slower now, more infrequent, as if the wood itself were huddling inward to protect its heart. He stared at the ceiling, where the shadows of the rafters looked like the ribs of a great, overturned ship, lost in a frozen sea. His thoughts drifted back to the clearing, to the way the jewoggle had pivoted with that terrifying, predatory grace. There was a geometry to its movement that defied the clumsy physics of the natural world, a precision that suggested it was not a creature of flesh and bone so much as a manifestation of the ridge's intent. He wondered what would happen if the sack ever tore, if the concentrated essence of 1,000 July afternoons were to spill out all at once onto the frozen ground. Would the snow melt in a violent, steaming rush, or would the flowers bloom for a single, frantic second before the frost claimed them? The mountain was a place of delicate balances, and the jewoggle was the hand that held the scales. A low, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the headboard of his bed, a sound so faint it was more of a feeling than a noise. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the settling of the cabin. It was the mountain speaking in a frequency meant for the stones and the roots. Elias closed his eyes, allowing his pulse to sync with the steady, subterranean beat. He felt a strange, detached sense of belonging, a realization that he was a temporary guest in a house that had been standing since the glaciers retreated. His life was a single, flickering candle in a cavern of eternal ice, yet he was part of the tally the spirits kept. He was a witness, and in the Rockton periphery, being a witness was a sacred vocation. The scent of bergamot was almost entirely gone now, replaced by the sterile, metallic smell of the snow. It was a clean scent, one that promised a scouring of the old year and a preparation for the new. Elias felt his breathing slow, his lungs expanding with the chilled air of the room. The exhaustion he felt was no longer heavy, it was a lightness, a surrender to the inevitable cycle that the creature in the woods represented. He wasn't just waiting for the spring, he was participating in the winter, becoming a still point in the turning world. As the first true light of the winter moon began to filter through the frost on the panes, casting a pale, blue glow across the floor, Elias Thorne finally let go of the waking world. He didn't dream of the wolf's snarling head or the heavy, feathered wings. Instead, he dreamed of a woven sack opening in a sun-drenched valley, the air thick with the hum of bees and the scent of wild clover. He dreamed of the mountain exhaling, a long, warm breath that carried the promise of the ridge back into the light. The cabin was silent, the fire was out, and outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks of the servant and the men alike under a shroud of perfect, indifferent white. The cabin drifted in a sea of absolute quiet, the kind of silence that has a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums until they hum with the phantom sound of 1,000 falling flakes. Elias lay beneath the heavy layers of wool and goose down, his breath a thin, rhythmic plume that caught the moonlight. The blue light of the winter moon was cold and clinical, illuminating the frost on the window until the glass looked like a slab of etched marble. It was a light that revealed everything but provided no comfort, turning the familiar contours of his home into a landscape of jagged peaks and shadowed valleys. He watched the patterns shift as the clouds moved across the sky, imagining the Jawaggle moving through similar shadows on the high ridges, its hooves striking the stone with the precision of a clockwork heart. The memory of the wildflower scent was a fragile thing now, a fading ghost that he tried to catch and hold in the back of his throat. He feared that if he let it go entirely, the winter would become an interminable void, a season without a beginning or an end. In the Rockton periphery, the mind could easily slip into a state of permanent frost, where the only reality was the cold and the hunger of the wind. The creature was the only thing that kept the narrative of the year moving forward, a grotesque but necessary punctuation mark in the long, white sentence of the Appalachian winter. Without the servant of the deep ridge spirits, the forest would simply stop, caught in a temporal eddy where the green world was forgotten. A low, subterranean groan vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that started deep in the limestone foundations of the mountain and traveled upward through the soles of his feet. It was the earth adjusting to the weight of the new season, a shifting of tectonic plates or the settling of ancient roots. Elias didn't flinch. He had lived in the shadow of the ridge long enough to recognize its moods. The mountain was restless tonight, perhaps unsettled by the passage of its servant or the sudden finality of the freeze. He felt a strange kinship with the stone, a sense that his own bones were becoming just as brittle and just as enduring. He was a part of the geology now, a sentient outcropping that the forest had allowed to remain. He thought of the woven sack again, wondering if there was a place in it for the small things he had noticed during the summer. The way the light caught the wings of a dragonfly over the creek, or the specific shade of orange in a tiger lily that grew behind the woodpile. If the Jawaggle carried the big memories of the forest, surely there was room for the minor details, the footnotes of a human life lived in the margins of the wild. It was a comforting vanity, the idea that his own observations were being curated and preserved in a vessel of spider silk and corn husks. It made the isolation feel less like a prison and more like a laboratory where he was the sole technician of the ridge's history. The wind suddenly dropped, leaving a vacuum of sound that was more jarring than the howl had been. In that sudden void, Elias heard a soft, rhythmic scratching against the exterior wall of the cabin. It wasn't the frantic clawing of a rodent or the heavy thud of a falling branch. It was a deliberate, sweeping motion, like a large wing brushing against the logs. His heart skipped a beat, the blood turning to slush in his veins. He stayed perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the door, half expecting to see the iron latch lift or the wood splinter under the pressure of a stallion's hoof. The scratching continued for a few seconds, a dry, feathery sound that seemed to be searching for an entrance, or perhaps simply marking the territory. Then, as quickly as it had started, the sound stopped. A single, sharp scent of crushed mint and damp earth permeated the room, cutting through the sterile cold like a knife. It was a parting gift, a small scrap of the summer's bounty left behind for the witness. Elias exhaled, a long, shaky breath that dissipated in the blue moonlight. He knew then that he was safe, that the bargain had been acknowledged. The servant had moved on, its task nearly complete, leaving the men to his vigil. He closed his eyes, the scent of mint lingering in his nostrils, and allowed himself to sink into the heavy, dreamless sleep of the valley. Outside, the snow continued its slow, silent work, erasing the cabin, the tracks, and the memory of the sun until only the ridge remained. The silence of the room deepened until it felt as though the cabin itself had been submerged beneath the black waters of a frozen lake. Elias did not move, his muscles locked in a state of hyper-awareness that transcended the simple need for sleep. The scent of crushed mint was a sharp, green blade cutting through the heavy, stagnant cold of the rafters, a sensory anomaly that anchored him to the living world even as the frost tried to turn him into a statue of salt and bone. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the rough-hewn contours of the beams, imagining the Jawaggle standing just inches away on the other side of the logs. He could almost feel the heat radiating from its muscled stallion legs, a furnace of biological energy that defied the sub-zero temperatures of the Pennsylvania night. The scratching did not return, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The oppressive weight of the winter storm had been replaced by a strange, expectant tension, as if the house were holding its breath alongside him. Elias felt the boundaries of his own skin softening, the distinction between his body and the wooden shell of the cabin blurring in the moonlight. He was no longer just a man huddling against the cold, he was a component of the Rockton periphery, a witness to the internal clockwork of the mountain. The Jewoggle was the messenger, but the message was written in the very marrow of his bones. It was a reminder that the deep ridges did not forget what they possessed, and that every leaf, every insect, and every human thought was a part of the grand, terrifying ledger the spirits maintained. He closed his eyes, and this time the darkness was not a void but a tapestry. He saw the flicker of the amber eyes again, not as a predator's gaze, but as twin lanterns guiding a heavy cargo through the shipwreck of the autumn woods. He saw the silver-gray fibers of the sack pulsing with a soft, bioluminescent glow, the trapped memories of July heat lightning and the taste of rain-washed blackberries struggling to escape their woven prison. The creature was a harvester of the ephemeral, a collector of the moments that most men let slip through their fingers like dry sand. In the silence of the cabin, Elias felt a profound gratitude for the monster. Without its hideous form and its tireless gallop, the beauty of the world would have no vessel, no way to survive the crushing indifference of the ice. A soft thud sounded from the porch, the weight of a heavy snowdrift finally sliding off the slanted roof. The vibration shuddered through the walls, a gentle reminder of the physical world's slow, structural decay. Elias let out a long, shuddering sigh, the tension finally draining from his shoulders. The mint scent was fading, replaced by the familiar, dusty smell of old wool and wood ash. The visitation was over. The mountain had finished its business with his corner of the valley and had moved its attention toward the higher peaks where the air was a thin, crystalline ribbon of silence. He reached out a hand from beneath the quilts, the skin instantly prickling in the bite of the air, and touched the rough logs of the wall. They were cold, solid, and real. He was still here. The fire was a memory, the sun was a promise, and the winter was a fact. He pulled his hand back into the warmth, curling his fingers into a fist as if he could catch the last molecules of the mint scent and hold them until morning. The blue moonlight continued to crawl across the floor, a slow and silent tide that marked the passage of the hours toward a dawn that would be white and blinding. Elias Thorne closed his eyes for the final time that night, his mind drifting into a deep, rhythmic peace that mirrored the steady, powerful gait of the servant of the deep ridge spirits, knowing that the memories of the forest were safe, and that he, too, was a part of what was being kept. The wood of the cabin sighed as it surrendered its final stores of heat to the hungry air. Elias lay in the absolute stillness that follows a visitation, his pulse a slow, rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking of the frozen timbers. The scent of mint had not entirely vanished, it lingered like a ghost in the back of his throat, a cool, sharp reminder that the boundary between the mundane and the monstrous had been briefly erased. He stared at the frosted window, where the moonlight turned the ice crystals into a jagged miniature of the very ridges where the Jewoggle now ran. He could almost see the creature in his mind's eye, its eagle wings flared slightly to catch the updrafts of the mountain passes, the heavy sack of summer swinging in a rhythmic arc against its flanks. The weight of the winter felt different now. Before the encounter, the snow had been a shroud, a heavy white sheet pulled over the face of a dead world. Now, it felt like a protective layer, a thick batting of insulation meant to guard the secrets the mountain had chosen to keep. The Rockton periphery was not dying, it was merely holding its breath, storing its treasures in the dark places where the frost could not reach. Elias felt a strange, quiet pride in his role as the watcher. He was the only one who knew that the July afternoon wasn't gone, only relocated, tucked away in a vessel of spider silk and corn husks by a creature that moved with the terrifying grace of a landslide. He shifted beneath the quilts, the friction of the fabric sounding like a roar in the vacuum of the cabin. The blue light on the floor had moved several inches, a slow-motion sundial marking the transition from the heart of the night toward the gray neutrality of pre-dawn. He knew that when he finally rose, he would find the world transformed. The porch would be buried, the woodpile would be a white mound, and the path to the spring would be a memory. He would have to dig his way out, his muscles burning and his breath freezing in his beard, but he would do it with the knowledge that the mountain was balanced. The ledger was closed for the season. The subterranean thrumming had ceased, replaced by the high, thin whistle of the wind through the eaves. It was a lonely sound, but it no longer carried the threat of the unknown. The unknown had already passed his door, had scratched against his wall, and had left him with the scent of mint and the memory of amber eyes. Elias felt the last of the adrenaline dissolve into a profound, bone-deep lethargy. His eyelids grew heavy, the frost patterns on the glass blurring into a soft, glowing haze. He was no longer a man fighting the winter, he was a man participating in it, his own heartbeat slowing to match the tectonic rhythm of the stone beneath his floorboards. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo, a wall of white that obliterated the hemlocks and turned the valley into a featureless void. In that chaos of ice and wind, the Jawaggle reached the high sanctuary, the cave where the seasons were stored, and let its heavy burden slide to the floor. The scent of bergamot, clover, and honeysuckle filled the dark, warm earth, a concentrated essence of life that would wait out the death of the year. Elias Thorne, safe in his fragile box of tinder and rusted nails, finally let his breath even out into the deep, restorative rhythm of a winter sleep, knowing that the sun was being guarded by the very nightmare that had haunted his tracks. The cold in the cabin was no longer a guest, it had become the master of the house, settling into the corners and draping itself over the furniture like a heavy, invisible shroud. Elias watched his own breath hitch in the dim, blue light, a rhythmic puff of silver that vanished against the rough-hewn rafters. He did not move to relight the fire, though the hearth was now nothing but a cold eye of gray ash. There was a strange, meditative peace in the frigid stillness, a sense that by allowing his own temperature to drop, he was becoming more synchronized with the mountain outside. He was no longer a warm-blooded intruder in a frozen landscape, but a part of the geology, a sentient stone waiting for the long shadow of the ridge to pass. The scent of mint had finally dissipated, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the ozone that preceded a deepening of the storm. He could hear the snow piling up against the windward wall, a soft, insistent shushing sound that whispered of the world being erased inch by inch. The hemlocks would be bowing low now, their heavy limbs dragging in the drifts, and the creek would be a jagged line of black water struggling against the encroaching ice. Somewhere in that white chaos, the Jawaggle was likely cresting the final rise of the high plateau, its stallion hooves finding purchase on the slick limestone where no horse should ever tread. He imagined the creature shaking the snow from its feathered wings, the amber eyes glowing with a cold, internal fire that mirrored the stars. His thoughts were slow, drifting like the flakes outside. He wondered if the creature felt the weight of its cargo as a physical burden or as a spiritual one. Did the scent of summer provide it with a phantom warmth, a memory of a sun it was never meant to bask in? Or was the Jawaggle merely a conduit, a mindless servant of the seasonal shift that felt nothing but the pull of the next ridge? He preferred to think of it as a guardian, a tragic figure destined to carry the beauty of the world without ever being able to participate in it. It was a lonely thought, one that resonated with his own isolation in the Rockton periphery. They were both watchers of the borderlands, observers of a cycle that moved with a cold and magnificent indifference to their presence. The wind outside suddenly shifted, a low, percussive thud hitting the door as if a heavy weight had leaned against the wood. Elias stiffened, his eyes snapping toward the iron latch. The silence that followed was thick and expectant. He waited for the scratching to return, or for the sound of a wolf's low growl to penetrate the heavy logs, but there was only the mournful whistle of the air through the chinking. The mountain was testing the integrity of his shelter, probing for a weakness that would allow the winter to rush in and claim the last of the cabin's inner life. He felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness for his small space, a refusal to be extinguished before the cycle was complete. He forced himself to sit up, the quilt sliding off his shoulders and exposing him to the biting air. His joints groaned in protest, but he stood, his feet finding the cold floorboards with a dull thud. He walked to the window and scraped a small circle in the frost with his fingernail, peering out into the monochrome night. The world was a churning sea of white, the trees visible only as ghostly vibrations in the wind. There were no tracks, no eyes, no sign that anything other than the storm existed. Yet, as he stared into the void, he felt a profound sense of completion. The Jawaggle had delivered its tithe, the mountain had accepted its burden, and the men had borne witness. He returned to his bed, the movement slow and deliberate, and pulled the layers of wool back over his body. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a dull, spreading numbness that felt like a prelude to a deeper rest. He closed his eyes, the image of the golden sack pulsing in his mind like a heartbeat. The summer was safe. The light was being held in trust in the high caves, guarded by the chimera and the spirits of the deep ridge. He let his head sink into the pillow, his breathing evening out as he finally surrendered to the pull of the winter. Elias Thorne fell into a sleep that was as deep and silent as the snow, knowing that when he woke, the world would be white, the fire would be cold, and the long wait for the return of the green would. The last of the blue moonlight slid across the floorboards, dragging the shadows of the rafters with it like the slow, skeletal fingers of the mountain reaching into the room. Elias did not open his eyes again. The numbness that had started in his feet had climbed to his chest, not as a harbinger of death, but as a profound anesthetic that numbed the sharp edges of his isolation. He felt the cabin breathing with him, the wood expanding and contracting in the grip of the sub-zero air, a rhythmic groaning that sounded like the deep, resonant purr of a predatory cat. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the man who cut wood and hauled water. He was a component of the Rockton periphery, a living stone in the foundation of the ridge. In the final moments before the heavy, velvet curtain of true sleep fell, he heard a sound that did not belong to the wind. It was a high, melodic trill, a sound like a silver flute played in a cathedral of ice. It echoed down the chimney flue, vibrating the cold ash of the hearth and shivering the small wooden deer on the mantel. It was the cry of the Jawaggle, stripped of its predatory gutturals and its mechanical labor. It was a song of release, a signal to the deep roots and the sleeping seeds that the cargo had been harbored. The bargain was sealed, the memory of the sun was locked behind the limestone gates, and the mountain was finally content to let the world go white. Elias felt a phantom warmth bloom in the center of his chest, a spark of the very bergamot and clover the creature had carried. It was a small, defiant heat that the frost could not touch, a pilot light that would burn until the first thaw softened the earth. He realized then that he was not just a witness to the monster, but a part of the memory it protected. One day, his own life, the smell of his tobacco, the sound of his axe, the grit of his stubborn survival, would be gathered into that woven sack and carried to the high places to be kept against the dark. He was a thread in the tapestry, a note in the mountain's long, slow song. The wind outside dropped to a whisper, the snow falling in heavy, vertical curtains that muffled the world into a perfect, white void. The scratching on the wall, the amber eyes, and the scent of crushed mint were gone, subsumed by the absolute neutrality of the winter. There was nothing left but the steady, subterranean heartbeat of the ridge and the soft, even breathing of the men in the bed. Elias Thorne let go of the last frayed rope of consciousness, sinking into the deep, dark well of the valley's winter peace. The mountain stood watch, the servant had vanished into the peaks, and the long, silent vigil of the Rockton periphery had finally, mercifully, come to its end.